Welcome to the New Books Network.
From Brandeis University, welcome to Recall This Book, where star anthropologist Elizabeth Ferry, hello, Elizabeth,
hello,
and me, not-so-star science fiction scholar John Plotz, invite scholars and writers from different disciplines to make sense of contemporary issues, problems, and events. So today we welcome Zach Horton, Associate Professor of Literature and Director of the Vibrant Media Lab at University of Pittsburgh. He is also, hold on to your hat, a game designer, a filmmaker, and a camera designer. So much as I want to hear about that set of vocations, we did in fact invite him today to talk about his new book from University of Chicago Press, The Cosmic Zoom: Scale, Knowledge, and Mediation. Zach, hello, welcome.
Thank you so much. Happy to be here.
Well, we're so happy to have you. Okay, so Zach, this dizzying book begins with a bravura description of a movie that I completely loved as a kid. I think I saw it at the Air and Space Museum, The Powers of 10 by Charles and Ray Ames. And that you might remember. Elizabeth, you and I have talked about it before, actually. Begins with a view of two people enjoying a picnic, and then it zooms up and away to show their surroundings all the way up into space, and then it zooms back in for a close-up on the hand of the picnicker, ending up, as I remember it, at least at the atomic level. So Zach, your book uses the cosmic zoom as a starting point to develop a cross-disciplinary theory of, and this is your phrase, scale as mediated difference. And there are reviewers who have loved the book, have put their finger on a couple of key questions. The question of scale, quote, as a matter of shape as well as size, or quality as much as quantity. And also they have praised it as a theoretical insight into how humans might have handled differences in scale and might do so differently. So a normative dimension as well as a descriptive dimension. And Zach, both of us have tons of questions of scale in our own work that we've grappled with. So it's exciting to come to them, via your book. And I have a whole aside here about naturalism and why I think naturalism is a problem of scale, but I'm not going to ask that. Rather, usually our first step when we invite someone in is to invite them to tell us about their book's key claims or its key discoveries, and then let the discussion flow from there. So may I hand over to you?
Great. Sounds good. The biggest problems of the 21st century, right, which I would say are climate change, resource scarcity, the transformation of public and private life by algorithmic processes, and the rise of neo-fascist populism, right? I list those at least as some of the largest challenges of moving in the 21st century. They're all problems of scale, right? And the book argues that to solve any of these, let alone the sort of dimensions between them, we need a high level of scale literacy. And then one of my key discoveries when researching this book is that, in my opinion at least, our scale literacy as a society is shockingly low. The reason we tend to think that larger scale means more abstract is because, of course, we're so scale bound, which is to say we are so bound to certain perceptual scales of the human that when we try to contemplate or represent some way other scales that diverge from the meso-scale of the human sensorium, we tend to do that through the human sensorium, and we tend to have a hard time actually exiting our own scale. And so what we do is we schematically represent those other scales, and then of course they actually do take on the characteristic of abstraction, because we're mediating them in ways that render them more abstract. But I think that this is more, it's partly a technological limitation, but it's more so, I mean, we have amazing technology for resolving other scales. It's more of a conceptual limitation, I think, right? That we're so used to thinking of the large scale, for instance, as something you might conceptually at least jot on graph paper, right? Or you mark out this sort of these abstract processes. But of course, our mesoscale is equally process-based, and larger and smaller scales are equally detailed and concrete if we only approach them that way.
One thread that runs through your book, and I have it formulated in a couple of different ways, but I think because I'm an English professor, I'll put it in terms of epistemology versus ontology, like the question of scale as a thing that we do, like we apply, an X where 1 inch equals whatever is the one factor. That's scale as an epistemological human operation versus scale as, well, I guess absolute's the wrong word, but kind of encoded in the universe in maybe the way that size is as a property. And I feel like you're not looking to solve that problem. You're trying to describe what it means that both of those are germane paradigms for scale. So can you say more about that?
Absolutely. Yes, this is actually really important. This is one of the fundamental arguments in the book, and actually something I think is really important for having a robust understanding of what scale is. And I came to this through the years of research. I came to realize that in most discourses, this concept of scales collapse in one direction or the other. In most of our discourse, right? We either believe that scale is purely a human construct, and this tends to be the case in the humanities, for instance, right? We tend to think of scale as a pure construct. Because obviously any scale, is defined by rhetorical practices, right? Discursively defined. So we know that, well, if you have let's say a domestic scale, we've defined that domestic scale, right? We've created this idea of a household and certain relationships that fall within, and right, we've defined what falls within and what falls without, and thereby created a milieu. Boundaries for a milieu. So in some ways that seems obviously true, and that leads many humanists to feel that scale itself is purely, it may or may not be useful as a concept, but it's certainly constructed by humans. On the other hand, in the natural sciences, for instance, scale is not a construct. In fact, scale has been scalar difference, which is to say that processes have different rules of behavior, act differently, present themselves differently ontologically at different scales, has been one of the fundamental advances in physics in the last 100 to 120 years. Basically, right, the quantum mechanical revolution was all about these discoveries, like these discoveries that scale matters, and the old clockwork universe of Isaac Newton is wrong, fundamentally wrong. Like the anecdotal like apple dropping from a tree and the planets moving in space don't act the same way, right? All scales do not have the same rules for physical behavior, and in fact they have radically different rules. And we know that in other domains like quantum mechanics, it's what we know versus what we actually incorporate in our perception and experience is, of course, they're at odds, right? And so we still treat the world as if it's Newtonian, even though we know that it isn't. And so in some ways, we have a lot to learn about scalar difference that we haven't yet, assimilated into our knowledge practices. So this question that you asked, John, between the epistemology versus ontology, where you fall disciplinarily tends to determine how you answer that question. And I really felt it strongly as I looked at both sides of this, that it's a mistake to collapse to either side, because both have to be true.
I like the point you make about sort of the the indexicality of science, or the necessity of attending to sort of a reality of a world out there. But can I sort of flip the question around and ask about the historicity of the meso-scale as the normative scale by which we make sense of the universe? And I guess by that, I sort of mean in the era of the Anthropocene, like that is in an era where we've seen human beings fucking everything up for every species, I guess. The anthropocentrism of the last few hundred years sort of comes to the fore. That is, like, man is the measure of all things as a paradigm, one of the paradigms that we use to understand modernity. So I guess it's just a question for you, whether you think historically about that mesoscale. Like, that is, does it seem just like innately human that humans would be the ground and the kind of zero unit for scaling, or is it more specifically something that, I don't know, I don't want to point the finger at Descartes or anybody in particular, but is it particular to the last few hundred years of Enlightenment thinking that humans get that priority in scaling?
Okay, I guess my answer would be that if we absolutely can point the finger at Descartes and other Enlightenment thinkers for at least making the problem worse. I won't say that's its origin. I mean, certainly we carry around media with us, right? Innately biologically, we have particular ocular properties in our eyes and optic nerves, and we have certain senses, and of course different species have different senses, and their sense of scale is different accordingly. But you kind of have to start somewhere, and so I do think it's natural. There is a kind of innate need to start with some kind of base scale, right? Some kind of meso-scale for the perceiving apparatus, whether it's biological or technological. So I guess we can be a little generous in that regard, that you have to start somewhere if you're going to perceive scale. But then there needs to be a medial process, and that medial process can take many different forms. And of course, it can take many negative, or what I would think of as negative forms of mastery, of domination, etc. Right? And humanity's has a pretty poor track record of using its transscalar techniques, not necessarily in generative ways. But I do think it's becomes much worse with European Enlightenment thinking, right? That with that tradition, you do suddenly have a more explicit concept of, as you said, man is the measure of all things.
It's so interesting because I was also thinking while I was reading about time scales, right? And one that comes to mind is that one of the clock, the sort of geological time clock, where humans like start at like 11:58. That seems to be doing the opposite, in the sense that it's rendering human scale as minuscule.
That's right. I mean, I agree with that, but I would also say that, you know, it's like the scale is the sword of Damocles, and it definitely it's all like you've got this idea that the oh well, human time frames are so shortened compared to the history of the universe, or human existence on Earth is so small spatially in relation to the universe. And I think these are generative, these are important discoveries, but they're not new. They're also not new discoveries. You have in Cicero, for instance, I talk about this a little bit in the book, the dream of Scipio. And this is a passage in De Republica from 50 BC, somewhere around there, which is all about this vision. It's a dream vision of floating off the Earth and entering into the cosmos and realizing that all of human activity is actually so minuscule in relation to the larger cosmos and larger time span. And in fact, the Roman Empire, seemingly, almost global, kind of covering the known world, seemingly so large and so important and so historic, everything is actually totally insignificant when viewed from a different scalar perspective, right?
Okay, I see that. I think I might say that with the development of geology as a discipline, the sort of intensity of that point of view is definitely takes off. So in the same way in which you might say that, okay, there's the sort of meso-scale for a long time, and there's a certain kind of bodily reality to that or something, but the Enlightenment intensifies it or amplifies it or activates it.
Geology, in some ways, is one of the central scale animating knowledge disciplines of our time, right? And has been actually for at least since the 19th century. And before that, geology, these long time frames were thought of as cyclical in Hortonian geology, for instance. And you could have large scales, but things didn't change ultimately, right? And so I think there is an extra component that modern geology produces, which is a linearity, which is to say that no, things don't always return, things don't always equalize, right? And that's really important, of course, to understanding the Anthropocene, which is really about a process that exponentially scales, right? And you have to understand tipping points and the idea that the future won't look anything like the past. And I think that is a very modern concept. And I agree with you that a lot of that comes from geology.
So this is a totally fascinating discussion, partly because I think we're talking about the like immediate consequences of shifting paradigms, but also the kind of unintended ramifying consequences of them as well. So the capacity to visualize things differently, Elizabeth, in the example you give of geology, but then the capacity also for science to act as a sort of technological tool of the human to have an impact that actually collapses scales rather than extending them, like rather than giving a vision of the sort of infinite extension of scale in either direction. The notion of natural resources is like, basically, how do we make millions of years of like organic life on Earth into a reservoir for fossil capitalism, as people sometimes call it. So I think that sort of continuing in that spirit of doubleness, I guess I have a question. How do we think about the era of scientific thinking in terms of putting the culture face to face with a vast distended scale when we compare it to like earlier theological or philosophical texts that also ask you to entertain the problem of vast difference? So like, I really loved your point, Zach, about Calvino being a great scalar storyteller. I totally agree. I teach cosmocomics for exactly that reason. But it made me think, well, isn't the Bible scalar storytelling as well? You know, it's not just consider Leviathan. It's like, you know, coming to grasp your own puniness compared to these distended magnitudes of something else. And I guess in a way, so the question is, Zach, does that fit into your account of the scalar, or would you say, oh no, that's not scale? Like we needed science before we could think about things scalarly. What you're talking about is something else instead.
A great question. I would emphasize the long history of scalar thinking. So I would agree with you, and I don't think we need modern science to start talking about scale. I think modern science inflects ontology a little differently, and that has really important resonances and really important implications for how we think about the cosmos, and the cosmos as scaled and having scalar articulations or joints in certain ways. But it definitely does not herald the beginning of scalar thinking. That greatly predates it. And indeed, I would say that, yeah, sure, the Bible is a scalar text, most definitely. And it's making arguments about not only the nature of reality and what the nature of the cosmos, but relational arguments about prescriptive arguments about what as humans, what our relationship to those other scales should be, right? Mm-hmm. I mean, it's really, if you were to diagram the sort of scales of the Bible, you have these different heavenly and hellish domains, right? And there's this, and then there's the earthly domain, and what's the scale of God, right? I mean, that's actually kind of an open or ongoing question throughout the Bible, right? Yeah. Is God a similar to a human scale, right? Is God a being with emotions and that you interact with, or is God the universe, right? And so that's actually, I mean, and of course, the different authors of the Bible don't necessarily agree on the answer to that question. So it becomes a kind of interesting ongoing question, not only in the Bible, but of course throughout the Middle Ages and theology throughout the era. So it's a great question. I mean, we've been grappling with these questions for a long time, and I guess one thing we could say is we've come up with different answers over time in terms of the nature of different scales. But I would also I would, then the next question or the meta question is, have we also changed our notion of scale itself, or are we just characterizing particular scales in different ways? I'm not sure that our concept of scale has radically changed. I think that we've done more work with scale, which is to say we've stabilized more scales, we've put them into greater conversations, and it's not just a question of disciplinary knowledge, it's also a question of technology, because technological advances have given us access to, or we've given us the ability to resolve many more scales than we used to be able to do. And so there is a conceptual question of how we stabilize scales, but that often maps onto, or there is in dialogue with, how our means of technologically stabilizing certain scales. And the invention of the microscope is so monumental in the history of scalar thinking, because all of a sudden, it's not that it invents the micro scale. We had conceptions of homunculi and and angels and all sorts of things that existed at that scale conceptually for us, but now we could actually resolve technologically new entities. And that's an example of a scale being stabilized culturally in order to then enable discovery encounters, what I call transcalar encounters, right? And suddenly these little creatures appear, and it blows our minds. It changes our conception of the cosmos, because all these little things we didn't know existed now pop into existence. We've discovered that they did.
You remind me that there's a golden age story. I don't think it's by Arthur C. Clarke. Maybe it's by like Shockley or something, in which they discover, they create a better electron microscope that goes three orders of magnitude closer, and they look at a pin and they see a whole bunch of angels dancing on the top of it. This is nice, like this moment of kind of like,
Absolutely. Yeah, I love that. I mean, in some ways, the subatomic level, quarks, they're amazing entities. They are angelic-like entities. At least they're as weird as angels, right? I mean, quarks are almost inconceivable. And you mentioned the Powers of 10, this amazing film, which actually anchors the kind of middle of my book, right? I kind of work up to things that preceded that and then things that succeeded it. And it stands as this monumental influence on scalar thinking. And in many ways, I sort of break it down and have many problems with it. But I too, when I first discovered that film when I was a kid, and it was playing at a science museum, and it was mesmerizing. And it's partly the mesmerization that I decided to sort of deconstruct in the book, right? And think about, well, wait a minute, what's the sort of political argument? What's the sort of ideological argument the film's making, and why does it give us one sense aesthetically and actually a different sense conceptually, right? So that was one of my questions, but one which I can jump back to. But in the making of that film, one of the things I discovered through archival research, is that there were huge ideological battles going on between the filmmakers, within the team. And that's one of the sort of fascinating things, is you see scalar politics and scalar conceptions play out in the production of any explicitly scalar media, which is why cosmic zooms are so fascinating if you sort of dig down and tease them apart, the sort of things that have to be collapsed in order to produce something like a smooth zoom. And in that case, there was a big argument about quarks. Some members of the team wanted to depict quarks, and some members thought, well, quarks are weird, and I don't really like quarks. Like, do they really exist? And in the mid to late 70s, quarks were a fairly new discovery. So maybe there was still a little bit of place to try to claim they might not exist. So it's funny how those kind of politics play out, right? Some members of the team thought atoms were really the scale central. That's the most important scale in the universe, is the atomic. And so we should construct the film to demonstrate that. And other people thought, no, the human is still the most important scale. So we should construct the film to suit that. And then, the question of quarks sort of, well, but isn't that the smallest scale we know of? shouldn't we depict that entity? But how do you depict a quark? Because quarks are so weird, right? They're not really particles, and they're sort of so. How do you even conceptualize and understand a quark? It's only 1/3 of a part anyway. So in the end, the film's a little bit of a muddle. And if you really look at it closely, you realize, well, there's parts of this that are really pulling in the direction of atoms. There's other parts that visually don't map onto the narration, for instance, and are really visually the human is the center of the film, even though narratively the atom is the center. And quarks get this kind of weird half treatment. So it's not neutral. This question of which of these scales is important or salient to us, right? It's actually political. All scalar media is political, just like all politics is scalar. In the 50s, in the early 1950s, Kiss took this idea. He wanted to explore this concept of scale in the cosmos and understanding the relationship between human perception and scale, and sociocracy, this political idea of this consensus based, in some ways based on that kind of Quaker model. Right. And the idea of sociocracy was that yes, you could have a consensus, a representative consensus-based government. So it would be representative, you'd have different governing bodies that would elect through consensus a representative, and then those representatives would come together. Yeah, so it's not a direct consensus, right? It's representative consensus. But you would then have those bodies would come together of representatives, and they would have to reach a consensus to make any decision. And when they did it, then they would send representatives to larger. And what's interesting about this particular political structure is that it's meant to scale. It can scale infinitely, right? And it relates both up and down. It goes up and down the scalar ladder, both directions, so that you have very, very local politics, very local political entities that are consensus based. But then you have these regional ones, and then you have these, larger regions, and it actually is meant to culminate in a global council that then is answerable to all the lower levels, right? So it's really kind of remarkable in that it's thinking about and this of course comes out of World War II, and it comes out of a desire to prevent this kind of global conflict that had just transpired, right? But Cass realized that for this to work, you can't just create this structure. That for this political structure to work, you have to have a cultural structure that is highly scale literate, right? You actually have to have people who know how to think at different scales, who can conceptualize the entire world at the same time that they can conceptualize the dynamics of the direct local. So the politics requires a culture that doesn't yet exist. And that's what, toward the end of Beatrice and Kess's lives, they realized that the project should shift, and that instead of politics with a capital P, there's a groundwork needed to be laid for this. And they started to wonder what kind of cultural groundwork could be laid for a scale-aware politics. And as they thought about it, Kess in particular had this idea of trying to think of forms of media that would help people understand, that would articulate scales together at the same time that it represented scalar difference at the different levels. And this is a tricky thing. And this is, of course, what I advocate for as well in the book, right? Is how can we create cultural forms and political forms and aesthetic forms that do both, that articulate scales together in relation to each other without collapsing the difference between the scales, so that we actually approach scale through difference rather than through homogeneity, and yet don't just focus on the local, right? To go back to something you asked earlier, Elizabeth, right? That we need to be able to think the global. We need to be able to think larger than the global. We need to be able to think the cosmic, but we also need to be able to think the microscopic. And the problem has always been that when we switch scales, we find a way to represent a different scale, we end up collapsing the other scales into that, or the new scale we collapse into the dynamics of a previous base scale. And this is so widespread. We just do this constantly, almost in most of our transcalar encounters. So how can we, the problem that I'm trying to articulate is very similar to that one that Boca articulated in the mid 50s. And his answer was to create this book, at least as a starting point. He created this book called Cosmic View, and each page shows a different, image of centered on the same thing, which is the school, the courtyard of the school, the Bergplatz, and then it zooms out and then zooms in. But zoom is not quite the right word, because what it does is as you turn each page, it jumps. And the subtitle of the book is 40 Jumps. Blanking on the full subtitle, but anyway, it's about jumps and not zooms, which is interesting and important, because it's articulating the difference, and it really takes in the text. It takes pains to articulate the difference between each one of these scales at the same time that they are related, right? And things that you can't see at one scale but are present on some level then become resolved at a later scale, or things that were resolved at an earlier scale disappear, or their larger context is revealed at later scales. The sort of interplay is very sophisticated. And the reason is that this isn't just an aesthetic experiment. There's an entire sort of politics of the future at stake here, right? So this book is really important and very carefully crafted over many years. And then that does indeed become an animated film called Cosmic View in the 60s. In the late 60s, this book gets picked up by a number of people and suddenly becomes rediscovered and seems really important. And what's one of the groups is the Ray and Charles Eames, who create this film called Rough Sketch, which is nominally an adaptation of that book, but becomes this huge contentious endeavor, and they collapse a lot of the differences of the book, and then that gets refined into the famous film by them in the 70s, Powers of 10.
This is a great moment to return to recall this book tradition, which is we each name a book or some other object potentially that might pertain to the conversation we had today. So Zach, do you have a recallable book for us?
Sure. I mean, first I would recommend to anyone Cosmic View, the book we just talked about. So it's kind of a cheat, so I'll give you another one as well. But that book, Cosmic View by Kes Boca, it's out of print. But it was popular at various times in history, and it's readily available and used. And so I think it's such an amazing book, such an amazing project that gets turned into some other, it gets remediated later in different ways that I find less generative, even though they've been highly influential. So going back to that book, I think is a completely worthwhile endeavor. Stuart Brand reviewed it in I think the 1969 Whole Earth Catalog, and called it a mind blow, and suggested that this is the sort of one of the essential books that one has to read to sort of understand the cosmos. That I think was part of its rediscovery process. But
can I just say I'm really glad you mentioned Stuart Brand, because I was trying to slip in a reference to Vince Brown's new film about the blue marble photograph, in which I discovered for the first time, maybe other people knew this, that Stuart Brand is more or less responsible for convincing NASA to set up the situation in which taking that blue marble photograph of Earth seen from space seemed like the logical way to bring awareness of the Earth as at pixel scale. So
right.
It's a fascinating connection.
This whole campaign in 1965, and with buttons that he would pass out to employees of NASA. Why haven't we seen a picture of the whole Earth yet?
Yeah.
And right, that actually pushed NASA to be thinking less to do something other than just science-based, right? Instead of just the scientific questions, that it got them to think a little bit culturally about how significant representation at those scales might be. And of course, Brand was right. But so anyway, the other recallable book, the far more obscure one, even more obscure, I should say, than Cosmic View, is I'll go with Micromegas, which is a novella by Voltaire, right? So it's from the mid 18th century. I think I only briefly discussed it in the book, and maybe I'm even confusing, and I discussed it in some other article that isn't in the book. But Micromegas is one of these kind of proto science fiction stories. It's about two enormous beings. There are, hundreds of thousands of miles large from another planet, and they're going on a kind of tour through the universe. And at some point they end up on Earth, visiting Earth, and they're so large that when they walk across the Earth and they only get like knee deep into the oceans, that's how large they are. And it's a really hilarious and fun book, because it's about the encounter of the Earth from this radically different perspective, which is exactly what transcalar thinking should be. And it's amazing, actually, that we get this in the era in which the centrality of the human is being shored up by so many other thinkers. And so, Voltaire uses this to skewer human pretensions of being, central or vastly important in the grand scheme of things. And these two big creatures at first think the Earth is devoid of life. There's just no life on this planet. They can't resolve anything. And this fundamental aspect of resolution that I talk about so much in the book is really important in this story. And finally, they think they see a little speck of something, and they look at it really closely, and it's a whale. It's like, the largest species on the planet. They see it as this tiny little speck, and then they get out and they create a makeshift magnifying glass, and finally they see a boat containing little specks that are humans. And they can't communicate at first. They have to create these kind of technological apparatuses to somehow translate sound between different scales. And they finally find a way late in the book to communicate with these little humans, which they think can't possibly be intelligent because they're too small to be intelligent, right? But it turns out they find that the humans do have some at least rudimentary intelligence, and they converse, and the humans explain their loftiest philosophies to these creatures, and the creatures, laugh at them, and so the cosmos was created for humans, and that's so funny that they like upset the whole Earth by laughing so hard.
So, Zach, you've made me reformulate. I was actually going to recommend Cixin Liu's three-body problem, because he talks about the problem of scale at the end as the problem that defines science fiction. But actually, Micromegas really makes me think of this Mark Twain piece, which was unpublished in his lifetime, called 3,000 Years Among the Microbes. So you're nodding your head, so you probably know it. But it's I think the subtitle is the anecdote of a microbe found in the ear of the tramp Blawitsky. And it's, it's just a sort of, it's a bit of a squib. I mean, it's probably shorter than Micromegas, but the notion of it is that no matter at what scale your society may be, and this is a microbe-sized scale, it has the same set of idiotic wars and problems with monarchy, problems with the distribution of power if monarchy is overthrown. And it really fits into the idea that I floated early but never really got to, which is that naturalism is fascinated with the problem of scale, because the idea is here comes the new boss, same as the old boss, like whatever size you're operating at, there's a perdurable logic of the universe that is going to be the same regardless. And I really appreciate, Zach, one thing I really like about your book is challenging that notion of scalability, which I think for naturalism becomes a kind of operative logic that you can show the sort of ironclad law of how every narrative will unfold, whether it be a microbe narrative or a human narrative. But the Twain version of that, the 3,000 Years Among the Microbes, is I don't know, it's funny naturalism. People don't believe that there's such a thing as funny naturalism, but that's actually it's the comic iteration of wherever you go, it's going to be the same damn corner in pork, is what Twain calls it. All right, fantastic. Well, with that, we should say, Zach, this has been a real pleasure. Thank you so much for taking the time to beam in.
Thank you. This has been a great conversation. Thank you both.
Yeah,
Thanks.
totally. And if you enjoyed this conversation, dear listeners, we encourage you to check out the Recall This Book archives at our website. Thank you all for listening, and hope to talk with you again soon. Recall This Book was founded by Elizabeth Ferry and me, John Plotz. It is sponsored by Brandeis and the Mandel Humanities Center. Sound editing is by Naomi Cohen, website design and social media by Miranda Puri of the English department. We're eager to hear your comments, criticisms, and thoughts. If you liked what you hear, please subscribe, rate, and review us on Apple Podcasts or wherever you get your podcasts. From all of us here at RTB, thanks for listening.